One aspect of St. John's Gospel that is peculiar to him are the details that he includes in the various passages of the Gospel. He tells us, for example, that Jacob's well is deep, that the pool of Bethsaida has 5 porticos. Very often he'll make liturgical references, as he does today when he says that what happened in the Gospel that we read today took place during the Feast of the Dedication. And he also mentions in today's Gospel that Jesus was walking about in the temple area on the portico of Solomon. And these details certainly give us the impression and conviction that the Gospel of John is an eyewitness account. But it's more than that. St. John is always up to something, you might say. And so the details also contribute to the meaning of the passages that we are reading. And today, of course, we hear the Lord talking about his being a shepherd of the sheep in response to the question from the Jews about whether or not he's the Messiah. So the Feast of the Dedication is the Feast of Hanukkah, and it celebrates the rededication of the Second Temple in Jerusalem during the Maccabean Revolt. Antiochus IV, the Greek king that was head of the eastern part of like in Syria and Babylonia, he had forbidden the practice of the Jewish religion and had forced them to adopt Gentile customs, including the eating of pork and doing things that would desecrate their observance of the law and make them unclean. And Maccabeus revolted against the Greeks, and he began to also put to death some of the Jews that had capitulated. And after he died, Judas took over, his son, and they eventually took back the temple in which Antiochus had erected a statue of Zeus on the altar and had sacrificed even pigs in the temple, which is a complete abomination. That's what you will hear in the book of Maccabees. I don't tell you that they put a statue there of Zeus, but that there was the abomination of abominations. So Judas had the altar removed and a new one built, and they purified the temple and rededicated it. And Hanukkah is a celebration of that rededication. And in the context of today's gospel, you know, the Jews were expecting a Messiah who would be like Judas Maccabeus and who would deliver them from the Romans. And I think the reference to the portico of Solomon, if you think about Solomon was the king right after David, the son of David. David was a warrior, Solomon was a man of peace, but Solomon oversaw the great expansion of the Jewish kingdom. It was a time of great peace and of riches. And so this is all calling to mind what was expected to happen when the Lord would come as the Messiah. And yet our Lord doesn't talk about his military might or his intention to deliver the Jews from the Romans. He talks about himself being a shepherd. The works I do in my Father's name testify to me, but you do not believe because you are not among my sheep. My sheep hear my voice. I know them and they follow me. He is a leader. He is the one to deliver his people, but he will not fulfill the expectation of those who thought he would be like Judas Maccabeus or another military king who would deliver them from the temporal affairs that were oppressing them. And I think the importance of this for us today is to remember that our trust in the Lord is something more than the kind of trust we put in one another and in our leaders in the world especially. Our trust is the fruit of hope, which comes from God, which is the conviction that God keeps his promises, that he will not fail, and that we understand the promises of God and the power of God to fulfill his promises in the context of his suffering, death, and resurrection. He is the good shepherd. All this we should understand in the context of the Old Testament and Ezekiel's prophecy, where the prophet speaks against the false shepherds who are not feeding the sheep, who are not shepherding the sheep, but are feeding themselves, who are abusing the sheep. God will establish himself as the true shepherd, and he will make David his prince. Jesus is the true shepherd who has come into the world. He has been sent by his Father, and he is the one to lead us. And remember also that that when the first Christians read the Gospel of John, this was already after the destruction of Jerusalem, and so the temple was in shambles. And our Lord in John's Gospel tells us that he is the temple. Destroy this temple and I will rebuild it in 3 days. So it's the Lord who is always the one to deliver us, in whom we can put our trust and our hope. And if sometimes we feel that we have been disappointed by those who should be there for us and our families, our friends, our politicians, whoever it might be, we've got to remember that it is the Lord in whom we put our trust, and the Lord keeps his promises. But sometimes when it's difficult to see that, as it is in these days, we need to have recourse to prayer and faith and to read the scriptures to understand that the Lord has given us these signs of his presence because he loves us and he wants us to know that he is present even in the midst of difficulty. He will deliver us, maybe not in the manner that we expect or would hope that he would deliver us, but the Lord is present and infinitely powerful, and he will always be with his people.